By mid-1942, America's industrial awakening was in full force, though Japanese intelligence had yet to grasp its true scale. The reports still trickled back to Tokyo: ships under construction, launches scheduled, hulls being fitted with engines and weapons. Yet, each report underestimated the speed, the efficiency, and the sheer manpower now dedicated to the war effort. In the Kaiser Shipyards of Richmond, California, massive cranes lifted prefabricated sections of hulls, each weighing hundreds of tons. Workers moved like clockwork, welding, riveting, and assembling as if time itself had been compressed. Men like Henry Morgan, a 37-year-old former truck driver, had learned to maneuver steel like clay. Women, many barely older than 18, operated welding torches and riveted decks with precision that rivaled the most skilled artisans. Night shifts ran alongside day shifts, their work punctuated by the ringing of hammers, the hiss of molten metal, and the pace, occasional shout in triumph when a section was completed. Every new ship that slid into the water was a quiet defiance of the Spies' assumptions. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At the same time, the Japanese continued their counting. Officers would glance at maps, measure silhouettes in aerial photographs, and tally hulls along the coasts. 351 ships, their laughter had faded slightly, replaced by cautious curiosity. Something was happening, they noted in their reports, though they could not yet quantify it. Even as carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers were added to the American roster, the Spies assumed the pace would slow. They did not understand modular construction, the division of labor that allowed multiple ship sections to be built simultaneously in separate yards before being assembled, like colossal puzzle pieces. By the end of February, Essex-class aircraft carriers were being laid down in multiple shipyards along the eastern and western seaboards. Each carrier was over 800 feet long, capable of carrying squadrons of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes across the vast expanses of the Pacific. Battleships, once thought sufficient, were reinforced with modern armor and anti-aircraft weaponry. Cruisers were retrofitted to carry more firepower, and destroyers multiplied in numbers, forming screens to protect the larger vessels. In Norfolk, Virginia, shipwrights worked in near silence, their movements choreographed to avoid collisions among hundreds of laborers. Steel plates, once mere metal, became the sinews of naval power. Workers like Robert Jenkins, aged 42, who had spent decades in small-town workshops, now found themselves part of something monumental. He hammered rivets with a rhythm that echoed across the dry docks, each strike a small contribution to a war he could only imagine from the shores. Nearby, young apprentices carried beams into place, their hands blistered and blackened, yet determined. This was no ordinary job, it was a campaign fought in steel and sweat. The speed of construction astonished those in the know. Where one carrier would have once taken nearly 3 years, these new techniques reduced assembly time to less than half. Prefabrication allowed the simultaneous production of hull sections, which were then assembled in dry docks with cranes taller than small buildings. Engines and gun turrets were installed in tandem with the hull, allowing for faster commissioning. Meanwhile, aircraft production kept pace, with planes being built in factories inland and shipped to coastal bases, ready to deploy from the newly completed carriers. The industrial rhythm of the United States became a weapon in itself, one that Japanese intelligence had failed to anticipate. By summer of 1942, the company, first of these ships, were nearing completion. Workers and naval engineers understood the stakes. Every rivet, every plate, every weld was part of a larger strategy that would determine the outcome of the Pacific War. Among them was Eleanor Smith, a 29-year-old welder who had left her teaching position to support the war effort. She would often step back from her work to gaze at the growing hulls, imagining them slicing through waves, carrying young sailors into battle. The Japanese spies, oblivious to this human component, continued to compile numbers, still assuming that America's production would plateau. Meanwhile, the American Navy was planning deployments. Officers like Admiral Ernest King monitored progress from Philadelphia to San Francisco, ensuring that construction schedules aligned with strategic requirements. Shipyard managers communicated constantly, relaying updates on hull completions, engine installations, and deck fittings. The coordination was unprecedented. Intelligence officers in Washington compiled reports not only on numbers, but on potential operational capacity. By late summer, they were able to estimate not just the total hulls launched, but the actual fighting potential of the vessels. In Tokyo, the situation grew more concerning. Reports now included phrases like unexpected output and capacity exceeds prior estimates. The spies began to recognize a pattern, though it was already too late. For every ship they counted, America was building 5, 10, sometimes even 20 more. This was not merely production. It was an industrial blitzkrieg, invisible to the enemy's eyes, yet formidable in its effect. On the West Coast, the shipyards became veritable cities of steel and labor. Workers slept in temporary barracks, meals were rationed to maximize productivity, and transportation networks moved raw materials at a pace previously unimaginable. Engineers introduced innovations to speed welding, improve hull, alignment, and enhance propulsion systems. The sheer volume of steel required seemed almost infinite, yet shipments arrived with precision, ensuring that construction never stalled. By October, the first Essex-class carriers were entering fitting-out docks. These vessels, colossal in size, represented a leap forward in naval warfare. Each deck could accommodate dozens of aircraft, capable of conducting strikes hundreds of miles away from the fleet. Armaments were installed simultaneously with aircraft elevators, and radar systems were calibrated even as hulls were polished for launch. The coordination between designers, engineers, and laborers reached a near-perfect tempo. Every day a new milestone was met, and with each milestone, the Navy inched closer to overwhelming force. In Philadelphia, the crews preparing battleships for service experienced similar intensity. Engineers retrofitted older hulls with modern weaponry and reinforced decks against aerial bombardment. Anti-aircraft, guns were installed alongside fire control systems that allowed targeting beyond the horizon. These ships were no longer mere floating fortresses, they were mobile arsenals capable of projecting unprecedented power. Every installation required precision, every delay could ripple across the entire fleet schedule. Yet, progress never faltered. Japanese intelligence reports by now were cautious, almost incredulous. The same officers who had laughed at 351 ships in 1940 now noted the remarkable acceleration and scale of production with a tone that suggested unease. They could not comprehend the underlying system: prefabricated construction, modular assembly, round-the-clock labor, and an unwavering national commitment to industrial output. By the end of 1942, it was clear that America's shipbuilding capacity had transformed from a modest pre-war fleet into a sprawling, dynamic force capable of overwhelming any Pacific adversary. By December, the first ships were commissioned. The Navy now had not just more hulls, but more operational vessels ready to deploy. Each commissioning ceremony was quiet, lacking pomp, but heavy with significance. Sailors, young and old, took their positions aboard these giants, fully aware that they were part of something larger than themselves. Captain William Harrington, aged 36, watched as his crew learned the intricacies of the new Essex-class carrier, understanding that every flight deck drill, every gunnery exercise, was a preparation for an unseen enemy who still underestimated them. Throughout the country, workers paused occasionally to reflect on the scale of their achievements. Eleanor Smith, now standing on the deck of a newly completed cruiser, could almost imagine the horizon as it would appear to sailors navigating hostile waters. Thomas Jenkins, leaning against a riveted bulkhead, felt a quiet pride. Every man and woman contributing to the shipyards understood their invisible but essential role in the Pacific War. The ships would carry the fight, but their construction was itself a decisive act of warfare. The Japanese spies continued their reports into early 1943. The tally of ships now included the Essex-class carriers, battleships retrofitted with the latest technology, light cruisers, and destroyers. Yet, their laughter had disappeared entirely. They began to use qualifiers like potentially unsustainable growth and output exceeds expectations. Even so, they still could not see the full scope of the industrial effort, the millions of man-hours, the innovations in construction, the relentless pace of assembly. By mid-year, the first fleets of newly built ships began trials off the coasts. Aircraft carriers launched squadrons of planes, battleships fired their guns in practice maneuvers, and destroyers patrolled simulated battle scenarios. Every ship's performance exceeded previous expectations. Naval officers took detailed notes, refining tactics, and preparing for the day these vessels would enter combat. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Japanese strategists revised plans, now recognizing that the underestimated giant was awake and building faster than anyone could have predicted. By late 1943, the United States Navy had transformed beyond recognition. What had once been 351 ships now represented only a fraction of the fleet America was building, commissioning, and deploying. The industrial war, conducted in shipyards, factories, and dry docks across the continent, had become as decisive as any naval engagement. For every hull the Spies counted, 5 more were under construction, ready to sail into the Pacific. And still, the work continued, with thousands of men and women pouring sweat, ingenuity, and determination into each new vessel, silently reshaping the balance of power in the war. By mid-1942, the United States had quietly embarked on a naval build-up unlike anything the world had ever seen. Shipyards from Philadelphia to San Francisco thrummed with activity, their dry docks filled with hulks of steel that would soon become instruments of war. Workers moved with purpose, their actions choreographed in a symphony of industrial efficiency. Henry Morgan, a 39-year-old former truck driver, balanced on a steel beam suspended above the water as a crane lowered a prefabricated hull section into place. The beam shifted slightly under his weight, and he gripped it with calloused hands, steadying himself while riveters hammered sparks into the air. The technique was revolutionary. Each ship constructed in sections, assembled like enormous building blocks, allowing multiple vessels to progress simultaneously in different yards. By the time Japanese intelligence reported a dozen hulls under construction, scores more were quietly rising from the slips along the coasts. Every ship carried a story. The USS Hornet, rebuilt after its destruction at Pearl Harbor, bore the sweat and toil of thousands. Each rivet, each plate of steel, had been touched, inspected, and shaped by men and women who understood the gravity of their work. The Essex-class carriers, originally a single blueprint drawn in a Philadelphia drafting room, now multiplied in yards across the continent, each one a floating fortress with wings for hundreds of aircraft. Japanese spies, still poring over aerial photographs and fragmented reports, could not fathom the scale. For every vessel they tallied, 10 more were rising in silence, unnoticed, awaiting their moment to shift the balance of the Pacific. The Navy's leadership, especially Admiral Ernest King, monitored every detail with meticulous care. Drafting tables overflowed with blueprints, schedules, and timetables. Calculations were precise down to the day. Launch dates, commissioning ceremonies, even trials at sea were charted months in advance. Shipyard supervisors coordinated workforces numbering in the tens of thousands, dividing tasks into sequences so intricate that any deviation could delay entire fleets. The industrial tempo was relentless. 24-hour shifts, molten steel poured into molds, welders casting arcs of fire over massive hulls, riveters hammering in unison. Women stepped into roles previously held only by men, operating welding torches, inspecting seams, and running cranes taller than small buildings. Teenagers and elderly volunteers alike contributed, learning new skills overnight in service to the nation. Cafeterias served thousands daily, and temporary barracks lined the edges of the yards, housing workers whose lives were consumed by the rhythm of production. Despite the extraordinary scale, Japanese intelligence offices clung to disbelief. Reports trickled in, describing hulls launched ahead of schedule, steel delivered in record quantities, and modular construction exceeding anything previously imagined. Officers in Tokyo noted anomalies, but the numbers were dismissed as statistical outliers, as if the United States could not sustain such frenetic output for long. They still assumed that industrial limits, material shortages, and worker fatigue would eventually cap production. What they failed to account for was American ingenuity, new techniques, assembly line specialization, and a national resolve that transformed every citizen into a cog in the machine of war. In Norfolk, Virginia, work on battleships mirrored the progress on carriers. Ships damaged in Pearl Harbor were retrofitted with modern armaments, armor plating reinforced, and anti-aircraft batteries installed in preparation for combat in the Pacific. Every shipyard was a fortress of steel, echoing with the sounds of hammering, welding, and the roar of engines being tested before installation. Engineers coordinated with naval architects to ensure that modifications did not compromise speed or stability. Deck layouts were optimized for the rapid deployment of aircraft, gun turrets were calibrated for maximum efficiency, and propulsion systems were tested under pressure far exceeding peacetime standards. Each ship was a testament to a collaborative effort, a floating embodiment of the nation's industrial might. California's Kaiser Shipyards became legendary for their output. Massive gantries lifted entire ship sections, while hundreds of workers guided them into place. Prefabrication meant that multiple hulls could be built simultaneously, with sections welded together like colossal puzzle pieces. Ships once expected to require nearly 3 years from keel to commissioning now emerged in less than half that time. This speed shocked American planners as much as it bewildered Japanese intelligence. Admirals visited the yards, inspecting progress and marveling at how innovation and labor could so dramatically shorten construction timelines. Meanwhile, aircraft production inland kept pace, delivering fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes to the decks of carriers, ensuring that new vessels were operational immediately upon commissioning. By August, the first of the Essex-class carriers were ready for launch. Thousands of hands had contributed to each vessel, a blend of men and women from all walks of life working under the pressure of war. Workers like Eleanor Smith, aged 28, paused briefly on a catwalk to gaze down at the steel leviathan below, imagining the sailors who would navigate it through hostile waters. Every weld, every bolt, every coat of paint carried the weight of history. These ships were more than tools of war. They were symbols of national determination and industrial supremacy. Japanese officers, monitoring progress with binoculars and aerial photographs, could no longer maintain their earlier confidence. Hulls slid into the water faster than anticipated. Deck cranes lifted aircraft as fast as they could be produced, and armaments were installed with precision and speed previously unseen. The Spies' reports shifted in tone from amusement to uncertainty, acknowledging that production far exceeded initial expectations, yet they still could not grasp the full scope of the industrial war unfolding across the American continent. Even as they tallied each new vessel, additional ships continued to rise in silent assembly lines across dozens of yards, their numbers multiplying like a hidden tide. In Philadelphia, work continued on both carriers and battleships. Engineers calculated stress tolerances, propulsion efficiency, and deck strength, ensuring that each ship could withstand the rigors of Pacific combat. Riveters, welders, and assemblers coordinated seamlessly, their labor synchronized by managers who had transformed war production into an exact science. Steel plates weighing several tons were positioned and secured with machinery designed for precision and speed. Engines were installed, while hull sections were still on the gantry, and gun turrets were mounted before final deck welding, an orchestration of effort that required careful timing and absolute attention to detail. Every delay, every misalignment was corrected immediately, ensuring that schedules remained on track. By mid-1943, the scale of production had reached staggering proportions. The United States was no longer simply replacing losses or building to expected quotas. It was creating a fleet capable of dominating the Pacific in quantity, quality, and operational readiness. Japanese spies, who had once scoffed at the 351 ships counted in 1940, now reported numbers that confused and alarmed their superiors. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers were being commissioned at rates unimaginable just a year prior. The pace was sustained by a national consensus. Every citizen contributed, every worker mattered, every shift brought the country closer to overwhelming force. In the shipyards, the human element remained at the forefront. Henry Morgan continued his work, guiding steel beams into place and supervising the placement of engines with the care of a surgeon. Eleanor Smith trained new welders, teaching techniques that allowed them to keep up with the furious pace. Cafeterias served thousands, medical stations treated injuries, and temporary dormitories provided rest for exhausted crews. The rhythm of labor was unbroken, day merging into night, week into month, with every completed hull a victory in an unseen industrial battle. The first trials at sea revealed the fruits of this immense effort. Newly commissioned carriers launched their squadrons of aircraft in coordinated exercises, while battleships fired volleys at targets miles away. Cruisers and destroyers practiced formation maneuvers and anti-submarine tactics. Naval officers documented performance meticulously, noting every adjustment, every system improvement. The ships were not only built, they were perfected before ever meeting an enemy. Every ship launched into the water represented months of planning, thousands of labor hours, and the coordination of a nation fully mobilized for war. Japanese intelligence, by now aware of the extraordinary output, struggled to explain it. Their reports noted that for every ship they counted, additional hulls appeared as if from nowhere. Industrial techniques, modular construction, and the relentless pace of labor remained invisible from thousands of miles away. The initial laughter at 351 ships had long vanished. In its place was unease, recognition that America had awakened, and a growing realization that the balance of naval power in the Pacific was shifting irrevocably. By the end of the year, the U.S. Navy had transformed beyond recognition. The once modest fleet of pre-war ships now represented only a fraction of what America could deploy. Shipyards were launching vessels faster than spies could count. Workers continued to operate with tireless precision, and the industrial engine of the United States had proven unstoppable. Each rivet, each weld, each hull sliding into the water was a declaration. The underestimated giant had awakened. The Japanese, who had once laughed at the number 351, now faced a fleet that would grow to thousands, overwhelming and reshaping the war in the Pacific. Every day, as ships left the yards, the balance of power shifted further, the silent victories of labor and ingenuity echoing louder than any gunfire. The year 1943 arrived with staggering force, carrying with it the relentless tempo of industrial mobilization that would redefine naval warfare forever. Japanese intelligence offices, still poring over photographs and reports, now recorded hundreds of new American ships, but their counts were still dwarfed by the true scale of the U.S. naval buildup. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels continued to emerge from shipyards at a pace that defied expectation. Across the country, from the foggy piers of Portsmouth to the sprawling dry docks of Norfolk, shipwrights, welders, engineers, and countless laborers worked with the quiet determination of a nation under siege, knowing that each rivet driven and each plate welded brought the fight closer to the enemy, yet far from home. Liberty ships, designed for speed of construction rather than elegance, rolled off assembly lines in numbers that once would have seemed impossible. Their holds, capable of carrying thousands of tons of supplies, ammunition, and fuel, became lifelines for troops scattered across the Pacific and the Atlantic. Each ship was more than a vessel. It was a symbol of national resolve, a floating testament to ingenuity and perseverance, and a logistical engine that allowed frontline forces to operate with unprecedented reach. Naval architects revised blueprints almost daily, accommodating innovations to accelerate production, enhance firepower, and reinforce hull strength. Turrets were repositioned for optimal coverage, anti-aircraft batteries were strengthened, and armor was recalibrated to resist new ordnance. In every yard, workers became masters of modular construction, assembling hull sections like colossal puzzles, each segment sliding into place with precision honed over months of repetition. The concept of overwhelming force moved from theory to reality. For every vessel counted by Japanese spies, the United States could launch 5, 10, even 20 more, their production lines operating in synchrony from coast to coast. The enemy had assumed limits, material shortages, labor fatigue, logistical bottlenecks, but American ingenuity, combined with a national will to endure, shattered those assumptions. Stories from the shipyards mirrored the heroics unfolding at the front lines. Samuel Rodriguez, aged 34, welded massive steel beams into the hull of a new cruiser in Wilmington, North Carolina. Sparks flew like fireflies in the dawn light as he leaned over the seam, torch steady in his hands. "We'll make Tokyo think the ocean's full of steel," he joked to his fellow welders, laughter bouncing off the cold metal walls. Their humor masked exhaustion. 20-hour shifts, rotating crews, and relentless deadlines left little time for rest. Yet morale remained high, because each completed vessel was tangible proof that the nation's industrial might was outpacing the enemy's imagination. In Seattle, the first of the new Essex-class carriers touched water, massive in scale, and armed to dominate the skies above any Pacific theater. Fighter squadrons, dive bombers, and torpedo planes would soon call these decks home, ready to strike across thousands of miles. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Supply chains, once vulnerable and slow, now functioned like clockwork. Steel arrived from inland mills, timber for scaffolding was shipped from the forests of Oregon and Washington, engines rolled off assembly lines in Michigan and Ohio, and ammunition was stockpiled along the East Coast for immediate deployment. No ship launched remained idle. Trials at sea tested propulsion systems, weapons, and navigational equipment. Crews, trained simultaneously on simulators and practice runs, learned to coordinate aircraft launches, gunfire, and fleet maneuvers with efficiency previously thought unattainable. Each vessel, from the largest battleship to the smallest destroyer escort, joined a growing network that projected American power with speed and precision, allowing operational planners to outmaneuver adversaries who had once assumed numerical superiority. Japanese reports grew cautious, peppered with uncertainty. Where once officers had written with confidence about the 351 ships that supposedly represented the entirety of American naval strength, their annotations now included phrases like unexpected capacity, production exceeds estimates, and possible undercounting. Tokyo strategists began to realize that for every vessel tracked, additional ships had already launched, commissioned, or were nearing completion in hidden shipyards. The tide of industrial warfare had tipped. The United States was no longer merely replacing losses. It was building a fleet capable of overwhelming any force the Empire of Japan could assemble in the Pacific. Every keeling, every launch, every trial run served as both preparation and deterrent, projecting a psychological force that unsettled even seasoned intelligence officers. At sea, the difference was palpable. Supply convoys, once vulnerable to enemy submarines and surface raiders, moved with the security afforded by sheer numbers. Reinforcements, equipment, and provisions flowed uninterrupted to distant theaters of operation, supporting campaigns on islands hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles apart. Aircraft carriers now served as mobile bases, extending the reach of air power over vast ocean expanses. Battleships delivered devastating shore bombardments, while cruisers patrolled critical shipping lanes. Destroyers, fast and agile, escorted convoys and hunted submarines, their presence ensuring that supply lines remained open. Each new vessel added to the fleet's capabilities, shifted the balance, a tangible manifestation of industrial and strategic superiority. Within the shipyards, innovation thrived under pressure. Engineers experimented with welding techniques that reduced hull assembly times from months to weeks. Prefabricated sections, once a novelty, became standard practice, allowing multiple ships to be built concurrently without interference. Cranes, some taller than small apartment buildings, lifted entire hull segments, guided by operators whose skill turned machinery into an extension of human hands. Dry docks bustled with activity 24 hours a day, lights illuminating every corner, ensuring work continued regardless of darkness. Temporary housing sprang up for workers travelling from distant towns, while cafeterias, medical stations, and recreation facilities maintained the workforce's stamina and morale. The shipyards became microcosms of the nation, a place where ordinary citizens were transformed into architects of victory. Every completed ship delivered a new set of opportunities. Carriers allowed air raids to extend further, destroyers protected convoys and flanks, cruisers provided heavy fire support, and battleships dominated in fleet engagements. Coordinated training exercises integrated these vessels, refining strategies that leveraged both numbers and technological advantage. Communication networks linked ships across the Pacific, ensuring that information moved as quickly as steel and fuel. Each addition to the fleet compounded the effectiveness of the others, creating a force multiplier effect that Japanese intelligence struggled to comprehend. Reports noted that operational readiness far exceeded prior assumptions, with crews trained, supplies stocked, and ships capable of sustained operations without returning to port for months. By the winter of 1943, the cumulative effect of production and deployment was undeniable. American industrial might had shifted the strategic landscape in ways that raw numbers alone could not capture. Japanese officers, who had once dismissed 351 ships as a trivial challenge, faced a reality in which the United States could field a fleet 5, 10, 20 times greater in functional capacity. Aircraft carriers outnumbered expectations, battleships bristled with armament, and the logistical backbone provided by Liberty ships ensured that every vessel remained operational. Even as Spies attempted to tally the ever-growing numbers, additional ships were launched from yards across the continent, their presence invisible until they joined convoys or fleets in the Pacific. The discrepancy between counted and actual ships became a source of frustration and strategic recalculation. Morale in the United States was bolstered by this silent victory. Workers understood that each day in the shipyards brought tangible results. Samuel Rodriguez, Eleanor Smith, and thousands like them took pride in their contributions, even as their efforts went largely unnoticed by the public. Yet their labour, repeated tirelessly day after day, produced effects far beyond the immediate. Every ship launched shifted the strategic calculus. Every aircraft carried by a newly commissioned carrier extended American reach, and every supply convoy protected by escort vessels sustained operations thousands of miles from home. The industrial war, fought in steel, fire, and sweat, was as decisive as any battle at sea. Meanwhile, Japanese strategists grappled with uncertainty. The reports, once precise and confident, became hedged, laden with qualifiers and warnings. The notion of American production limits had been shattered. For every vessel identified, additional ships were already commissioned, under construction, or planned. The tipping point had arrived. The numerical and operational advantage had moved irrevocably toward the United States. Strategists realized that even well-executed campaigns could not overcome the sheer volume of vessels, aircraft, and logistics that now defined American naval power. The Pacific, once considered Japan's domain, was no longer a foregone conclusion. By the end of 1943, the United States Navy had become a force of staggering magnitude. Hundreds of vessels had been launched in a single year: Liberty ships, Essex-class carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers joining the growing fleet. Each addition, meticulously designed, assembled, and launched, extended operational reach and enhanced combat readiness. Supply chains flowed efficiently, crews were well trained, and shipyards continued to innovate, increasing output further. The cumulative effect was clear. For the first time, the Pacific was under American control not only by force of arms but by industrial capacity, a reality that Japanese intelligence could neither ignore nor fully comprehend. In every dry dock, on every deck, in every rivet and weld, the message was unmistakable. The underestimated giant had awakened. Tokyo had once laughed at 351 ships, but the laughter had faded, replaced by alarm and cautious recalculation. Across the Pacific, American convoys moved with newfound confidence, carriers projected power further than ever before, and battleships patrolled critical sea lanes with assurance. The tipping point had arrived, and with it, the knowledge that industrial might, when fully mobilized and expertly applied, could dictate the course of a global conflict. By the conclusion of 1943, the United States Navy was no longer a collection of ships. It was a force that reshaped the strategic landscape, a testament to what determination, ingenuity, and unity of purpose could achieve when measured not in months, but in the relentless output of an entire nation. The year 1944 marked the zenith of American industrial power, a period in which the country's shipbuilding capabilities reached unprecedented heights and the scale of production became a force unto itself. By this point, 6,000 new ships had either been launched, commissioned, or were actively under construction across the continental United States. The Japanese, who had once mocked the mere 351 ships they believed represented the totality of American naval strength, now faced an uncomfortable truth. Numbers alone were meaningless when production could overwhelm the entire Pacific Fleet in months. In shipyards from San Diego to Long Beach, towering cranes lifted aircraft carriers the size of small towns, their steel skeletons glinting under the sun as workers hoisted pre-assembled sections into place. Decks were meticulously painted, guns mounted, and planes stored in ready-to-launch formations, each vessel a floating testament to the nation's determination. Battleships and cruisers lined the harbors like sentinels, engines tested and armor reinforced, awaiting orders that would carry them into the pivotal battles of the Pacific. The scale of the effort was breathtaking, and the impact was immediate. The Japanese Navy, long confident in its numerical superiority, now faced a maritime opponent capable of producing and deploying ships faster than they could be counted, let alone sunk. Intelligence reports that once inspired smug laughter in Tokyo now prompted urgent recalculations. Strategies rewritten to account for amphibious invasions, defensive posturing, and desperate attempts to impede the unstoppable American industrial machine. Within the shipyards, the human element of this industrial surge was no less remarkable. Men and women labored in relentless shifts, their hands forging hulls, riveting steel, and welding beams that would carry thousands of tons of men, fuel, ammunition, and aircraft across thousands of miles of open ocean. Each ship launched was more than a vessel. It was a statement of resolve, a declaration that the United States could, and would, produce more than any enemy could destroy. Teenagers and retirees, mechanics and teachers, all contributed in some measure to this massive endeavor, learning to operate machinery, master welding techniques, and coordinate complex assembly processes. Lieutenant Commander William Halsey, Jr., preparing for the next fleet operation, regarded these ships not merely as tools of war but as lifelines, embodiments of freedom, and the tangible promise that American reach and resilience could extend across the vast Pacific. The Essex-class carriers, newly completed and launched, carried aircraft in numbers and formations previously unimaginable. Their flight decks, a stage for squadrons of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes capable of striking hundreds of miles from the nearest naval base. In every harbor, the presence of these carriers altered the strategic calculus. Enemy forces could no longer maneuver freely, and supply lines once considered secure were now vulnerable to strikes launched from seemingly every direction. Across the country, the production tempo was relentless. Shipyards ran 24 hours a day, with shifts overlapping to maintain continuous output. Engineers refined blueprints daily, streamlining processes to cut assembly time while enhancing structural integrity and firepower. Prefabricated hull sections, once a novel concept, became the standard, allowing multiple ships to be assembled simultaneously without interruption. Steel from inland mills flowed by rail and barge to coastal yards. Engines rolled off assembly lines in Ohio and Pennsylvania, and armaments were stockpiled and delivered with astonishing efficiency. Temporary housing sprang up to accommodate the swelling workforce, including cafeterias, medical facilities, and recreation halls to maintain morale. Despite exhaustion, Workers found pride in their contribution, understanding that each rivet, each weld, each completed section propelled the nation closer to victory. At sea, the impact of this industrial surge was equally profound. Supply convoys, protected by destroyers and guided by experienced captains, delivered vital reinforcements and matériel to distant theatres of war, ensuring that troops could operate without fear of interruption. Aircraft carriers projected power over vast expanses of ocean, launching strikes on enemy installations, shipping lanes, and fortifications with unprecedented range and precision. Battleships and cruisers patrolled strategic passages, providing heavy, fire support for amphibious operations and suppressing enemy defences. The integration of new vessels into coordinated fleets allowed for complex maneuvers, extending the reach of American naval power across the Pacific, from the Aleutian Islands to the Solomon Islands, from the Philippines to the Marshall Islands. For the first time, American forces could sustain simultaneous campaigns over thousands of miles, a direct result of the industrial output that had transformed shipyards into engines of war. Japanese intelligence, struggling to keep pace, began to record reports with unprecedented caution. Officers who once dismissed American capacity as limited now noted the extraordinary number of vessels being commissioned, launched, and deployed. Where once they had counted 351 ships, they now faced the reality of a fleet numbering in the thousands, each new addition enhancing operational capabilities beyond calculation. Strategic assessments reflected this shift, with plans for counterattacks reconsidered and defensive positions strengthened, though always with the recognition that the American industrial machine could replace any losses far faster than they could be inflicted. Tokyo's confidence was eroding. The psychological advantage it had once enjoyed was slipping with each launch, each commissioning, and each ship deployed to patrol the vast Pacific theatre. The human dimension of this naval surge remained central. Men like Samuel Rodriguez, now aged 35, continued to weld, rivet, and guide pre-assembled sections into place, often working 14 to 16-hour days. Women, trained rapidly in welding and assembly techniques, operated cranes, prepared engines, and inspected hulls with meticulous care. Even teenagers, too young for enlistment, assisted with assembly and logistics, contributing to a war effort that required the total mobilization of a nation. Each person's labor, often repetitive and exhausting, took on greater significance when viewed as part of the vast, interlocking machinery of war. Every rivet driven, every plate welded, every crane lift executed contributed to the creation of ships capable of traversing thousands of miles, sustaining combat operations, and projecting power far beyond the reach of their builders' immediate perception. By mid-year, the first of the Essex-class carriers joined active fleets, their decks alive with the hum of activity as aircraft were prepped, armed, and launched on exercises designed to simulate combat conditions. Pilots, mechanics, and deck crews coordinated with precision, preparing for the challenges of carrier-based warfare that would soon define the Pacific conflict. Battleships, fully armoured and bristling with firepower, joined alongside cruisers and destroyers, forming task forces capable of overwhelming any isolated enemy unit. The presence of so many vessels simultaneously on the water created both strategic and psychological effects. Enemy reconnaissance could not fully account for their numbers, and even well-coordinated opposition found itself outmatched before the first engagement began. In addition to their combat capabilities, these ships carried logistical support that multiplied their effectiveness. Ammunition, fuel, spare parts, and medical supplies travelled with the fleet, reducing dependency on distant ports and allowing sustained operations across vast distances. Liberty ships and other auxiliary vessels ensured that every frontline unit remained supplied, reinforcing the notion that American industrial might was inseparable from military success. Where once naval operations had been constrained by supply lines and port facilities, now the fleet operated with autonomy and confidence, enabled by a continuous stream of materiel and personnel. As the year progressed, the cumulative effect of these efforts became undeniable. 6,000 ships, launched, commissioned, or under construction, were not merely numerical achievements. they represented a fundamental transformation of the balance of power in the Pacific. Every additional vessel compounded the capabilities of the fleet, extending range, firepower, and operational flexibility. The United States no longer merely replaced losses inflicted by enemy action, it outproduced them to an extent that made attrition warfare virtually meaningless. Japanese planners, constrained by limited resources, could not match the speed, scale, or coordination of American production, and every engagement increasingly reflected this asymmetry. Strategically, the implications were profound. Amphibious invasions could be supported with overwhelming firepower, supply lines remained secure, and air power could be projected over vast distances with unprecedented accuracy. The presence of multiple task forces operating simultaneously created operational dilemmas for the enemy, forcing them to disperse their forces and defend against threats that could appear anywhere across the Pacific. Confidence in prior numerical advantage became irrelevant in the face of a continuous, unrelenting production and deployment machine. Each vessel launched, whether a carrier, battleship, cruiser, or destroyer, became a multiplier of strategic capability, allowing the United States to dictate the terms of engagement and exert influence over an area previously contested by Japan. By the close of 1944, the tipping point had fully manifested. American naval power, underpinned by industrial output, technological innovation, and human labor, had reached a level that Japanese strategists could neither ignore nor fully comprehend. Carriers dominated the skies, battleships controlled surface engagements, and supply chains ensured sustained operations at unprecedented distances. 6,000 ships, each the product of countless hours of human ingenuity and labor, served as more than instruments of war. They were declarations of national resolve, embodying the capacity of a nation united in purpose and effort. The Pacific, once contested and uncertain, now lay under the shadow of overwhelming force, a force that combined engineering, coordination, and determination in ways the enemy could not counter. Workers in every shipyard, from the coasts of California to the rivers of Pennsylvania, understood the magnitude of their contribution, even if they never saw combat. Each rivet, each welded seam, each completed hull represented not just steel and machinery, but the embodiment of freedom, resilience, and the will to dominate an enemy through superior organization, innovation, and scale. Sailors who took command of these ships recognized the significance of their tools. They were instruments of strategy and symbols of a nation's ability to translate industrial capacity into decisive power. Lieutenant Commander Halsey, observing a fleet of newly launched vessels, reflected on the distance traveled from the mockery of 351 ships to the reality of thousands, a transformation that made clear the United States could project force anywhere, anytime, and in numbers that defied expectation. In conclusion, 1944 stood as the year in which American industrial might reached its zenith, reshaping the balance of naval power across the Pacific. 6,000 ships, each meticulously designed, constructed, and deployed, created a force capable of overwhelming any opposition through sheer numbers, coordination, and operational reach. Intelligence reports that once prompted laughter in Tokyo now inspired caution, recalculation, and strategic hesitation. From shipyard floors to open waters, from welded beams to aircraft on flight decks, the United States demonstrated that production, innovation, and perseverance could achieve what seemed impossible, rendering prior assessments of strength obsolete. Overwhelming force was no longer a concept. It was a tangible, operational reality, a testament to the unyielding capacity of a nation fully mobilized for total war, and a prelude to the decisive campaigns that would follow in the Pacific theater. By 1945, America's industrial might was undeniable. In just 2 years, 6,000 ships had emerged from U.S. shipyards, a scale that left Japanese intelligence in shock. The laughter at 351 ships had long since faded, replaced by grim acknowledgement and frantic defensive planning. Every aircraft carrier, cruiser, destroyer, and liberty ship represented countless hours of labor. Riveters, welders, crane operators, engineers, and apprentices, all contributed to a machine that translated steel, sparks, and sweat into floating power. Leyte Gulf and other naval battles showcased this industrial triumph, where fleets assembled were not just tactical forces, but monuments to manufacturing. Every ship launched ensured that losses could be replaced, sustaining pressure across the Pacific and giving commanders the freedom to dictate operations. The human element was central to this victory. Workers like Thomas Jenkins, aged 38, recalled hammering steel plates into hulls, while welders like Ruth O'Connor transformed raw metal into vessels capable of withstanding enemy fire. Each individual contribution, often invisible to the enemy, became a decisive factor. Shipyards operated day and night, prefabricated hulls accelerated production, and modifications for armor, armament, and aircraft capacity were implemented faster than ever. The result was a navy capable of sustained operations, projecting power across thousands of miles and rendering Japanese attempts to contest the seas futile. By the war's end, the Pacific had become effectively an American lake. Victory was as much about production as combat. Every rivet hammered, every hull launched, every schedule met was a step toward dominance. 6,000 ships, built in just 2 years, transformed the balance of power, proving that industrial capacity and human ingenuity could achieve what strategy alone could not. America had demonstrated that wars could be won in factories as decisively as on the water. Years later, in 1960, retired Admiral King stood quietly at the Norfolk shipyard. Only a handful of vessels remained from the Second World War, preserved as memorials, their hulls glinting faintly in the afternoon sun. He ran his hand along the cold steel deck of an aircraft carrier, imagining the hundreds, no, the thousands, that had poured from shipyards in just 2 short years. Japanese intelligence had counted 351 ships and had laughed, confident that America's industrial capacity was limited. They had been wrong. America had built 6,000 more. Every ship, every bolt, and every hand that worked through day and night shifts had contributed not only to victory in battle, but to a triumph of industrial determination. The Pacific, once a theatre of death, fear, and uncertainty, had been transformed into a vast arena dominated by the sheer weight of American production and ingenuity. Children visiting the shipyard in the 1960s gazed up at the massive hulls, unaware of the decades-long struggle that had brought them here. Veterans smiled quietly, remembering the laughter of enemy spies, the rhythmic pounding of rivets, the roaring engines, and the unbroken promise of a nation determined never to be outbuilt. The lesson remained timeless. In modern war, industrial output, numbers, and human determination could overwhelm even the most confident enemy. The world would never forget the scale, the speed, and the ingenuity that turned 351 ships into 6,000, leaving a legacy of steel, resolve, and national pride that would echo for generations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.